They were once rivals. Now they are on the same team, but they don't even say hello to each other. Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler ignored each other during warm-ups, and the tension in the arena rose. Before reading the story, write your comments about your favorite basketball team. Golden State Warriors training court, early morning. The stands of the Chase Center, lit by dim lights, were still empty, but the atmosphere on the court was as if it were filled with the breath of thousands of people. There was an inexplicable tension in the hall. As teammates scattered across the court to warm up, it seemed as if everyone's eyes were searching for only two people, Jimmy Butler and Stephen Curry. Once stars of different teams, these two superstars were now wearing the Warriors jersey. On paper, it looked like a dream team, but recent events had begun to chip away at that dream. It all started with Jimmy's comments about the All-Star MVP. Though he didn't name names, his words, "Some players should carry the value of the real game, not the media," were interpreted as a direct reference to Steph. The media immediately made headlines out of his statement. Steph's response? Silence, of course. But that silence felt more like a loud noise to those present. Now, months later, they were warming up together for the first time. Steph stepped onto the court and went through his usual routine. He dribbled the ball away from the three-point line, took a few shots, and exchanged brief words with his teammates. But his facial expressions and glances seemed to indicate that he was completely oblivious to Jimmy Butler's presence. Jimmy was practicing shots alone in the middle of the court. His arms were tense, and his eyes were narrowed. He hadn't looked in Steph's direction, even once. Perhaps this hurt even more. There was no shouting, no arguing. There was only indifference and disregard. These two players, who had respected each other even when they faced each other in different jerseys years ago, now seemed to be in different worlds, even though they were on the same team. The fans were well aware of this. The camera angles tried to capture both of them in the same frame, but it was futile. It was as if they were trying not to be in the same frame. When they returned to the locker room, nothing was said. Even the coach didn't dare break the silence. Because this wasn't just a personal issue. It was like a seismic fault line threatening the team's spirit, and the breaking point was fast approaching. Jimmy slammed the ball hard onto the floor and looked up at the basket. He took his shot. Swish. A clear sound echoed through the silence. But even that sound wasn't enough to catch Steph's attention. Steph was at the three-point line, his back turned to Jimmy, dribbling the ball with his foot. His eyes were on the floor, his mind elsewhere. Perhaps in the past, perhaps in the arguments, and perhaps in the words Jimmy had implied. And then, the moment came. Jimmy walked past Steph, a few steps ahead of him. Steph didn't look up. Jimmy shrugged. They continued walking as if denying each other's existence. For perhaps the first time, it felt like a sign of an invisible war, even in front of their teammates. Amidst all this tension, one thing stood out above all else. This was no longer just a professional disagreement. It was more like a battle of pride, respect, and broken promises from the past. And even wearing the Warriors jersey didn't seem enough to mend the rift. That day's game at Chase Center wasn't just a match. It was the first chapter in the leadership battle between Jimmy and Steph, and the story was just beginning. As game time approached, Chase Center began to fill up. The spotlights came on, the music started playing, but the energy in the arena felt a little different than usual. The fans felt like they were coming to a big duel, not just another NBA game. Everyone had their eyes fixed on the same spot, Jimmy Butler and Stephen Curry. They would be competing in the same uniform, fighting for the same goal, and thankfully, it was only on paper. As the first 5 announcements were made, Steph smiled as usual and greeted the crowd. Jimmy, on the other hand, walked toward the basket without looking up, his jaw clenched. They had to stand side by side, on the same line, and fighting for the same goal. But their eyes didn't meet. As the coach gave his final tactics in the team huddle, Steph stood on the right, and Jimmy on the left. They were only a few steps apart, but those few steps seemed to represent the sum of thousands of words, hurt feelings, and silence between them. The buzzer sounded, and the first quarter began. Steph had the ball. His expression was blank as he dribbled. The cheerful Steph was nowhere to be seen that night. There was no dancing, no star enjoying himself on the court. He passed the ball to Jimmy. Jimmy took it and headed for the basket. A hard layup and a score. But there was no reaction. No applause, no clapping. Jimmy didn't even look back at Steph as he slowly ran back. Throughout the first quarter, there were only a few passes between the two. But these passes seemed like obligatory deliveries. They showed neither confidence nor team spirit. Jimmy didn't even react to one of Steph's assists. When the pass from Jimmy's hand reached Steph's hands, Steph just shook his head and continued. The audience was, of course, aware of this. His teammates were aware of it too, and actually the ones who were most aware of it were the two of them. Finally, by the middle of the second quarter, the tension had already started to spill onto the court. Jimmy took the ball and drove toward the basket one-on-one. The opposing center rose up to block him, but Jimmy cleverly got the ball past him and scored. Steph was right behind him, but he didn't even extend his hand to acknowledge him. As Jimmy turned back, he made eye contact with Steph. At that moment, the atmosphere in the entire hall changed. Their eyes met. For the first time during the game, they had directly acknowledged each other's presence. But there was no warmth or understanding in that look. It seemed to convey only one message. "I'm here." Steph's face froze for a moment. Then he took the ball and quickly went on the attack. Jimmy was in the corner as he passed the defender. Steph didn't pass to Jimmy. He took a three-pointer and scored. Steph didn't even look at Jimmy as he turned back. But Jimmy was watching him, and that look actually said more than words ever could. "I understand." The coach called a timeout. The players came to the sidelines. Sweaty jerseys, furrowed brows, and teammates seemed caught in the middle. Not a word was spoken between the two. Draymond broke the silence by turning to Jimmy and whispering a few words. But Jimmy immediately turned his head away. The game resumed. Jimmy was even more aggressive now. So much so that every time he moved toward the basket, he turned toward Steph. Steph did the same, playing close to Jimmy on every offense. They weren't passing to each other or doing anything else, as if they weren't playing on the same team. It had turned into a silent competition. They were two stars, fighting separate battles in the same uniform, and this battle was just beginning. Of course, everyone watching was eagerly awaiting what would happen next. When halftime rolled around, the score was close and the tension was high. The fans were talking more about Jimmy and Steph's glances than the game itself. Videos were circulating on social media, and posts comparing clips from the old days with today's silence had already begun to spread like wildfire. Once upon a time, these two men had chased championships together and walked shoulder to shoulder in the same arena. But now, when they should have been doing the opposite, they couldn't even stand next to each other. And this silence was reminiscent of a scream. The second half was about to begin, and the coach was talking to the players in the locker room, but all Jimmy could hear was his own inner voice. Steph was in a corner, staring at the floor, trying to control his breathing. Outside, thousands of people were watching a basketball game, but they had no idea that inside, two men were rewriting their legacy. The second half of the game had begun. The dim lights of Chase Center suddenly went out, the music stopped, and then the sound system echoed again. The crowd applauded, but neither Steph Curry nor Jimmy Butler responded to the applause at that moment, because there was the same thing in both of their eyes, a silent challenge. Steph took the ball and surveyed the court for a moment. Jimmy stood directly across from him. There was no word, no signal between them, only pure focus. Steph dribbled, Jimmy closed in. Steph moved to the right. Jimmy followed step for step. Then Steph stopped suddenly, stepped back, and launched the three-pointer. The ball, of course, found the net as expected. Steph didn't even look at Jimmy as he turned, but he glanced over his shoulder. For some reason, Jimmy didn't respond to the glance. He took the ball and immediately went on the attack. This time, Steph was on defense. Jimmy drove to the basket, and Steph stepped in front of him as he passed the defender. Jimmy jumped, and Steph jumped at the same time. The collision was inevitable. The ball hit the basket, bounced, and Steph got the rebound. Jimmy fell to the ground, quite hard. Steph paused for a moment, unsure what to do, but didn't reach out his hand. Jimmy got up on his own. The spectators noticed this, and their voices rose. But Steph was focused only on the game, and moved the ball forward. Everyone in the arena now understood that this was personal. Every time Jimmy got the ball, he was even more determined. As he drove to the basket, he seemed to want to break not only the defense, but also all the emotions that had built up in the past. Steph, on the other hand, felt that the leadership he had built over the years was being challenged. For him, this was not just a game, but a response to an attack on his legacy. Throughout the third quarter, the game between the two began to tense up like an invisible string. Every three-pointer Steph made was a message to Jimmy. Every battle under the basket Jimmy fought was like a challenge to Steph. But this battle was continuing between the two of them in a very quiet manner. There was no shouting, no showmanship, just pure competition. Even when sitting on the bench, they were careful not to sit next to each other. While Steph was icing his knee in one corner, Jimmy was fiddling with his shoelaces at the other end. The distance between them was not just physical, it was as if there was a wall between them. Their teammates tried several times to bring them closer together, but none of their attempts were successful. And then the fourth quarter began. The game was neck and neck. The coach called a timeout, and the final play was being planned. Everyone's eyes were on those two men again. Jimmy looked up at the playboard without raising his head. Steph kept his eyes on the coach, but couldn't help stealing glances at Jimmy from time to time. The silent rivalry between them was beginning to affect the team's balance. Decisions were being delayed on the court, passes were becoming difficult, and energy was being divided. As the final minute began, the score was tied. Steph had the ball. The crowd's noise turned into a roar. Steph crossed the line. Jimmy was waiting in the right corner. An opportunity arose. Jimmy was open. Steph could see him, but he didn't want to. He fixed his eyes on the basket and took the three-pointer. The ball spun around the rim and didn't go in. The opposing team got the rebound and launched a fast break. Jimmy ran back, caught the player who had stolen the ball, and took it. Then he turned around, grabbed the ball without looking at Steph, and made a reverse layup. And that was the score. Golden State took the lead. Steph didn't say anything. The coach was yelling from the sidelines, but Jimmy couldn't hear him anymore. He was almost out of breath, but it wasn't just from exhaustion. This shot wasn't just for the game. This shot was for honor. His eyes drifted to Steph. Steph tried to avoid eye contact, but this time he couldn't escape. At that moment, they were both finally thinking the same thing. They were on the same team, and they were fighting for the same goal. But that jersey didn't seem to be enough to solve everything. When the final buzzer sounded, Golden State had won. The fans rose to their feet, and excitement filled the arena. But Steph and Jimmy turned their backs on each other once more and walked toward the locker room. That night, neither man felt like he had won his battle, because in this battle, there was no winner yet. There was only an unbreakable silence, an unseen distance, and an unresolved reckoning. And the story didn't end there. It had simply turned to a new page. As the final whistle echoed through the arena, everyone was on their feet, applauding. The Golden State Warriors had won. The scoreboard had announced the victory, but that was never the real story. The real story seemed to be hidden in another quiet competition that had been unfolding throughout the game. Jimmy Butler struggled to silence the thoughts racing through his head as he walked toward the locker room. They had won, yes, but he couldn't seem to find peace within himself, because this victory had come at a price. It was easy to be a team, but staying a team was the real test. Steph followed him inside. They didn't look at each other or speak. Silence was once again the only thing they had in common. While the other players celebrated, clapping their hands, the two stars experienced a silent coldness within themselves. The coach tried to gauge the mood to give his victory speech, but he too could feel the tension between them. Every sentence that came out of his mouth was careful and well-balanced. It was as if he was afraid of stepping on broken glass. After the game, the press conference began. Steph Curry was the first to face the cameras. He tried to smile, but the expression on his face showed that he was tired. The questions were as expected. "Is there a problem between you and Jimmy?" Steph didn't look away, but he didn't answer either. He just nodded and said a classic phrase. "Everyone is there to win on the court. We're focused as a team, and we won. That's all." Short, clear, but it was a soulless answer. Then Jimmy entered the room. He looked directly at the reporters. The questions started pouring in. Are you upset that Steph didn't pass you the ball? Are you and Steph on the same page? Jimmy waited silently for a moment. Then he fixed his gaze and replied, I'm just a guy who talks on the court. For me, it's not words that matter. It's actions. We won. That should be enough, I think. This was just as clear and concise, and just as emotionless. Social media was already ablaze. The coldness during the game, the lack of eye contact, and the refusal to pass the ball. Each moment was turned into short clips and shared millions of times. Images from the old days were juxtaposed with the present, and the question, "What happened to you?" was on everyone's lips, repeating itself over and over again. It was unthinkable that these two men, who once walked shoulder to shoulder with smiles on their faces, were now turning their backs on each other on the same court. And everyone could see it. But the story didn't end on the court. The next day, at a team meeting, the coach made a decision. All the players would be called in for individual meetings. Steph was called in first. It didn't take long. Then Jimmy came in. Of course, silence reigned here as well. Jimmy answered the questions briefly. He didn't say anything bad about Steph, nor did he defend him enough. But one sentence he said froze the room. I came here to win. I want to fit in. But I think everyone else should want that too. The coach just nodded as if to say, You're right, because there was nothing more to say. Practice became very quiet. There were no more jokes or laughter. Steph was practicing his shots in his corner, while Jimmy was focusing on one-on-one plays on the opposite side of the court. The distance between the two was now directly affecting the team's energy. Even the younger players were visibly tense. Then one day, the team's media relations person suggested an interview. Steph and Jimmy should do an interview together and put an end to the rumors. The answer was clear. No. Of course, neither of them wanted to. After all, the problem between them was not a rumor, but a reality. As time passed, this situation began to reflect on the results on the court. The rhythm within the team was disrupted. In consecutive games, the number of assists dropped. Jimmy's performance was strong individually, but he seemed detached from the team play. Steph, on the other hand, was slightly behind his usual pace. And from that moment on, everyone began to ask, can the same jersey really bring two different men together? Or were there conflicts that couldn't be suppressed by championships or team spirit? Yes, Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler were stars on the same team, but they were no longer heroes of the same story. They were like two names living in different sentences, separate paragraphs. And this story was still being written. As the days passed, the problem remained unsolved, only growing quieter. Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler were talking less, but their feelings were more palpable. Team practices, game meetings, and plane rides. Everything might have looked normal from the outside, but something was always missing on the inside. That missing thing was the bond between them. Every player had their place in the Golden State Warriors locker room, but the space between Steph and Jimmy was more emotional than physical. No one could fill that void. Perhaps no one dared to, because both of them were simultaneously the source of the silence and prisoners of it. It was one of the team's media days. Interviews, promotions, and sponsor shoots. The players took turns in front of the cameras. Steph came out of the studio smiling. Then Jimmy entered. The same cameras, the same lights. But of course, the same expressions were not on their faces. A reporter asked Jimmy directly, "What's going on between you and Steph? Do you think this situation is affecting the team?" Jimmy paused for a moment. He bowed his head slightly and then replied in a calm tone, "Sometimes people walking toward the same goal may choose different paths. The important thing is to stay on that path." The sentence was as elegant as it was meaningful. At that moment, Steph was in another studio, answering a similar question. "I like to trust my teammates. Trust, of course, takes time to build. Silence sometimes says more than words." Now, instead of speaking directly to each other, these two men were speaking through the microphones. But silence, of course, cannot last forever. The calendar showed another big game. The Warriors were facing one of the most formidable teams in the Western Conference. It was a crucial game. The standings, the chance to make the playoffs, the media pressure. It was as if everything had come down to this night. At the pre-game meeting, the coach began his speech as usual. Tactics, matchups, defensive plans. Then, after a brief pause, he continued. "There's one more thing," he said. "It's not just talent that takes the court. It's spirit. And tonight, gentlemen, we have to show our spirit." There was a deep silence in the room. The coach's eyes shifted from Jimmy to Steph. Everyone already knew who those words were meant for. And the game had begun. Steph opened with a three-pointer. The crowd rose to their feet and applauded. Jimmy went to the basket on the counterattack, was fouled, and stepped up to the line. He made both free throws. It was a battle for victory, yes, but the energy on the court was beyond that. In the second quarter, Steph got the ball. While the opposing defense was breaking down, Jimmy was open in the corner. This time, Steph glanced over, hesitated, and passed the ball. Jimmy caught it, took a deep breath, and sent the three-pointer to the basket. The arena held its breath as the ball was in the air. Swish. Jimmy turned back without looking at the basket. Steph looked at him. For the first time, their eyes truly met. They didn't smile or nod, but that look finally meant something else. Acceptance. Steph came to Jimmy's screen on the next possession. Jimmy came out of the screen. Steph got the ball and passed it to Jimmy, who dunked it. They had played together, but they were truly together. And in that moment, everyone at Chase Center felt that something had changed. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was at least a start. Throughout the game, the duo passed the ball more. They still didn't talk, still didn't make physical contact, but they always moved together. They were on the same page on the court. Not just to win, but to connect and put the pieces back together. In the final minutes of the game, the score was tied. Steph got the ball and drew the defense. Jimmy came in fast from the opposite side. Steph passed the ball at just the right moment. Jimmy jumped and finished. Golden State took the lead. And in the final defensive play, they were together again. Steph applied pressure at the top. Jimmy came in to help at the bottom, and the opponent couldn't score. The game was finally over. Victory belonged to the Warriors. Steph extended his hand. Jimmy hesitated for a moment, but then he extended his hand as well. They shook hands. Again, it was brief, silent, but this time, it was meaningful. The crowd went wild, but there was only a calm expression on their faces. At the end of the day, not only had these two men won, but they had also taken a step forward, perhaps not toward each other, but toward the brotherhood, respect, and old bond they had left behind. And this could be the beginning of everything, because sometimes stories don't end when they end, but when the heroes change, they begin again. And for Jimmy Butler and Stephen Curry, this was exactly that moment. They had a new story to begin again. Do you think Jimmy and Steph truly reconciled, or was this just the calm before the storm? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss where this story is headed.